If you're watching this video, chances are you either have another Fuji camera and you're considering upgrading to the X-T4, or maybe you're thinking of getting into the Fuji ecosystem for the first time. So I'll try to answer two questions separately in this video. If you're buying a Fuji for the first time, should you get the X-T4? Or if you're an X-T3 holder, should you upgrade to an X-T4? As I think the answer to each of those questions may well be different. I have an X-T3 and I think it's a phenomenal camera. But there were always a few things that I'd wished it had, however. What I most wanted was Ibis, and yes, at the risk of inflaming some, I actually wanted a Flippy screen. You know, back when I got my X-T3, I was deciding between this and the Panasonic GH5. The GH5 is a great camera, and it checked the boxes with, tremendous Ibis, and it had that Flippy screen. But based on my evaluation criteria, I opted for the X-T3 despite it lacking that Ibis and the Flippy screen, and I've been very happy with my choice because it's an absolutely great camera. So into the X-T4, which actually now gives me those two things, the Flippy screen and Ibis, and a number of additional improvements that they've packed into that camera. So you have Ibis, you have the Flippy screen, you have improved autofocus, improved battery life, some additional film simulations, the dedicated movie versus still mode, and a bunch of other features that they've packed in there. Yet at the same time, some things remain stubbornly the same as the X-T3 in terms of the sensor and the processor, making the upgrade question much harder to answer. Now the biggest thing I wanted to test first was the Ibis, so we'll start there. So of course the X-T4 has Ibis, and then it has the optional extra digital stabilization as well. Now the Ibis does make a massive difference, even if it isn't quite perfect. For the record, I did update the firmware to 1.02 prior to using it and running these tests. Now I chose a test first that would somewhat exaggerate the shake, but not artificially so. I used a 90mm and held the camera higher up to film my bookshelf, and it's not a very stable position. And that 90mm focal length, of course, also exaggerates literally every little single micro jitter. Now here you can see it both with without the Ibis and with the Ibis, and it makes quite a difference. And here I put on digital image stabilization. Here I didn't really see any performance difference, but I did notice kind of a weird pulsing if you pay close attention to the lettering on this book spine. And this only manifested with digital image stabilization on. Very minor, but overall I didn't really see digital stabilization doing much to the image. Now moving on to a more real-world test, I went outside and I used the 18-55 lens, which is of note because it has OIS on the lens. So here you have up to 3 levels of stabilization working. You've got the lens itself, then you've got Ibis on the camera, and you've got the digital stabilization as well. And I tested it with and without the digital stabilization. And I'm also comparing it to the GoPro as well when I do these tests. Now I admit I had high expectations, but I feel like my GoPro actually offers better stabilization, and that's digital stabilization only. And I appreciate the GoPro is a very large crop, but I fail to see why camera manufacturers can't offer the same level of digital stabilization if I'm willing to accept that crop factor. So here we have Ibis with a stabilized lens, and you can see how that compares and how it looks to the GoPro. And now we're doing Ibis with the stabilized lens and digital image stabilization on as well. Now to be clear, the Ibis isn't perfect, but it's leaps and bounds ahead of what you have in an X-T3 that has nothing, and despite its imperfections, I really do wish that I had this in my X-T3. Autofocus on the X-T4 gave me better results than on the X-T3, and I can't quantify it precisely. I'd say that after a day of shooting photos with both the X-T4 and the X-T3, I had about 20 to 30% more photos that were properly focused on the 4. And as much as I love my X-T3, it can sometimes do stubborn things like this photo where 4 or 5 of the shots were completely out of focus before it actually nailed focus on a stationary object. I also found that when taking a traditional slow autofocus lens like the 56, it operated better on the X-T4, allowing me to capture some great images with a phenomenally great lens. The Ibis also helps with being able to shoot with slower shutter speeds. Here is the same picture taken with an X-T4 with Ibis enabled and an X-T3, both with a 90mm lens. At a quarter-second shutter speed, you can see the difference it makes, which is quite substantial. So there's definite autofocus improvements on the X-T4. However, it isn't perfect either. I often got quite a few false positives on face tracking, and it didn't always do well with fast-moving toddlers. Honestly, I do feel that this is Fuji's weak point compared to some of what is available on the market today, but regardless, the X-T4 does better than its predecessor. I know people will talk about these issues potentially being fixed in a future firmware update, but it's hard to make a decision or recommendation to you based on a theoretical update, assuming it could even be fixed via software. Now, the GH5 tried as much as they could with firmware updates, but their hardware constraints will forever hinder its autofocus, and I don't know how much Fuji can actually do via firmware updates. As for the Flippy screen, there's no real point of me actually reviewing it. I mean, it's a Flippy screen, and yes, it flips. It works as intended. Now, for vloggers or for recording videos like this, it is handy. I had to buy an external monitor for my X-T3 to be able to frame myself for these videos. But now the Flippy screen, can ignite passion in people. Some people absolutely hate it, and they prefer the tilt mechanism of the X-T3. If your use case is photography only, I can see the X-T3 being advantageous. But for my hybrid use case, I did want a Flippy screen, back when I was looking at the X-T3 versus GH5. So I do like that it has been added. Battery life is improved. It's a larger capacity battery. Supposedly this one will get 500 shots as opposed to 390 shots. It's nice, but it isn't critical in my evaluation criteria. But, maybe that is something that is important to you. One thing I do love is the new dedicated stills and movie switch. The metering mode dial is gone in favor of a video and stills switch or toggle switch. Now, for me, this was a worthwhile trade-off since I don't personally find myself changing metering modes all the time. Your needs may, of course, be different, but changing between photo and video is an action that I constantly use, and it's nice not to have to constantly, juggle your different settings every time you switch. I was a little surprised that they still haven't added a 180-degree shutter rule so that your shutter speed could default to twice your frame rate for video, like the Panasonic has, but maybe they'll add that one day. So which one? The X-T3 or the X-T4? Now, my opinion is that this really depends if this is going to be your first Fuji or if you're looking to upgrade. Let's first look at users who are going to get Fuji for the first time but wondering which one do they get, the X-T3 or the X-T4. For me, the X-T4 makes perfect sense for those who don't yet have a Fuji and you're looking to buy the first Fuji and get into the Fuji ecosystem. It is the best Fuji X series camera to buy on the market right now, without a shadow of a doubt. And I'd venture to say it's probably one of the best or better APS-C cameras on the market as well. I definitely buy it over the 3 because it has some significant enhancements, and for the next 12 months or so, it's going to receive all the love from Fuji in terms of firmware updates. Arguably, this camera is more future-proof, and for the price difference, my recommendation would be to buy the X-T4 if you're new to Fuji and considering between the X-T3 and the X-T4. The harder question is whether these improvements warrant me upgrading as an existing X-T3 owner. Now, I'm not a professional generating income from my gear, so I'm speaking to you as a hobbyist, which may impact my assessment or be different to your criteria. The primary reasons that I might upgrade would include the fact that it has Ibis, a Flippy screen, and the improved autofocus. The reasons that I would likely skip the upgrade would include the fact that it has the same sensor and processor as the X-T3, its first-gen Ibis isn't perfect, and Fuji autofocus is still not industry leading. I already bought an external monitor so I can frame myself when recording these videos, so the Flippy screen kind of dropped down in priority, but the Ibis is a dramatic step forward even if some kinks need to be worked out. Out of all the improvements on the X-T4, this is the one that I most wish that I had had on the X-T3. Autofocus is improved for sure, and as much as I do love Fuji though, this is the one thing I'll ding them on, is that I feel their autofocus is still lacking behind some of their peers, and while the X-T4 has improved, it still isn't as good as it could be. There's no doubt that the X-T4 has many improvements over the 3, But the X-T3 itself is a dynamite camera, and it didn't become less so with the arrival of the 4. So for me, I'll hold off on upgrading for now, as my X-T3 is a classic example of good enough and is begging to have thousands more photos taken with it.